A billionaire visited his son's grave and saw a waitress crying there with a boy. What he found out shocked him. Subscribe and write where you're watching this video from. The rain came down in steady threads, whispering against the wide glass windows of the master bedroom where Caden Hale sat alone, staring at the framed photograph balanced on his knees. It was a photograph he had seen so many times that he could no longer remember if it truly captured the moment or if he had simply memorized each detail until it became more vivid than reality itself. His son, Jalen, no older than 6 in the picture, smiling with a paper airplane in his hand, caught mid-laugh, sunlight touching the soft brown of his skin and the glint in his dark eyes that had so often looked at Caden with hope. Caden did not remember what he had been doing that day, only that his phone had been ringing, the weight of negotiations with men in suits heavier in his ear than the voice of his boy calling him to come outside and catch the airplane together. He remembered telling Jalen, not now, maybe later, as he turned away to discuss the closing of a factory deal that would expand Hale Industries' grasp across 3 states. Now, with the rain tapping like thin fingers against the glass, there was no phone call important enough to answer, and there was no later left to promise. The master bedroom was cavernous, its high ceilings and imported marble floors gleaming under the soft hum of lights that seemed too bright, too sterile for a morning like this. Caden could hear the emptiness of his home, the echo of rain muffled only by the soft hum of the air conditioning, the ticking of the watch on his wrist that marked each second he could not reclaim. Outside, the driveway was slick, the reflection of the wrought iron gates bending under the weight of the storm. His security team had the car ready, a black, armored SUV that idled like a patient beast, waiting to carry him to the one place he allowed himself to visit on this day each year. Jalen had been dead for 7 years. 19 years old, gone in the space of a breath and the screech of tires, and Caden had felt the loss like a physical amputation, though he did not know it until the funeral was over, and the last of the visitors, dressed in muted grays and blacks, had left him alone beside a coffin he could not open. 7 years, and not a single day had passed that Caden did not think of what he would have said to his son, what he would have given to change the sound of that phone call in the middle of the night from the coroner, his voice flat and professional, to something that was not death wrapped in words. He rose, setting the photograph carefully on the dresser as if it might break, adjusted the cuff of his tailored black jacket, and left the room with the soft tread of a man who had grown used to moving through empty spaces. In the hallway, portraits lined the walls, family members long dead, business partners shaking hands. Jalen, at his high school graduation with his cap askew, and that same unstoppable smile. Caden's footsteps echoed in the hall, a reminder that wealth could not fill the spaces that grief carved open. As the car pulled away from the gates, the city stretched around him, buildings rising like steel and glass monuments to ambition. He had conquered this city, made his name a currency that could buy silence, could open doors closed to most men. He had the penthouses, the cars, the jets that waited on tarmacs with engines purring, and yet there was nothing among these acquisitions that could bring back the laughter of the boy who had once called him Daddy. The city gave way to neighborhoods with cracked sidewalks and chain-link fences, to storefronts with signs that flickered with failing neon, to the quiet hush of suburbs where trees bent under the weight of the rain. It was here, in a modest cemetery on the outskirts of Memphis, where Jalen had asked to be buried, rejecting the family plot in Atlanta that was surrounded by marble angels and carefully manicured grass. Jalen had said he wanted to rest somewhere real, somewhere the wind could touch him, somewhere the world did not pretend to be more than it was. At the time, Caden had been too lost in his grief to argue, and now, standing in the cemetery with rain dripping from the brim of his umbrella, he was grateful for this single request that had given him a place to return to each year. The cemetery was quiet, the rain muting the world into a soft gray hush, the headstones like rows of silent witnesses to the grief that people left behind when they walked back to their cars. Jalen's grave was marked by a simple stone, chosen by Caden because his son had loved simplicity, had never cared for the grandeur that his father's money could buy. The name, Jalen Hale, the dates, and a single line beneath, loved beyond measure, gone too soon. Caden stood there, the umbrella trembling slightly in his hand, water dripping down onto the stone as he bent to place a single white lily, the petals already bruised by the rain. He closed his eyes, letting the rain run down his face, pretending for a moment that they were tears, that he could still cry for his son. He had not been able to cry at the funeral, had not been able to cry when the lawyer read Jalen's will, had not cried when he packed away his son's belongings into boxes that still sat unopened in a locked room. The sound of a child's laughter broke the silence. It was a small sound, high and clear, like the chime of a bell that rang through the fog of his grief. Caden turned, his eyes narrowing as he saw them, a young woman standing a few paces away, her dark hair pulled into a messy bun that dripped with rain, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold in the pieces of her own grief. Beside her was a small boy, no older than 5 or 6, his skin a warm brown, his hair curling against his forehead as he ran circles around the woman, holding a paper airplane aloft, letting it fly into the wet grass with a shout of delight before chasing it again. The sight struck Caden like a blow, as if the air had been knocked from his lungs. The boy's laughter was too familiar, too sharp, cutting through the steady drum of rain to pierce the quiet that surrounded Jalen's grave. The boy turned, lifting his head, and for a moment their eyes met. Wide, dark eyes, the same shape as Jalen's, the same spark of joy that had once lit up every room his son entered. The resemblance was so strong that Caden felt his knees weaken, his grip tightening on the handle of the umbrella to steady himself. He looked at the woman, her face pale against the gray sky, the lines of exhaustion around her mouth, the shadows under her eyes. Her jacket was thin, her shoes soaked through, but she did not seem to notice, her gaze fixed on the grave, her lips moving in words he could not hear, her hand clutching the small hand of the boy who had returned to her side, pressing close to her leg as if sensing her sorrow. The scene felt like a violation, an intrusion into the space Caden had claimed for his grief alone. This grave was the last connection he had to his son, and yet here stood a stranger, weeping at Jalen's resting place, a child laughing in the rain, turning the somber moment into something alive, something he was not prepared to face. The boy looked up at his mother, his small hand reaching for the paper airplane that now lay damp in the grass, and she knelt, brushing the wet hair from his forehead, whispering something that made him nod solemnly before he looked back at the grave. Caden's breath caught as he saw the boy place the airplane gently against the headstone, the paper already wilting under the rain, the ink bleeding from words that were scrawled in a child's handwriting. He could not see the words, but he felt their weight, felt the echo of a promise he had never made, could never keep. The boy looked back once, his eyes wide and curious, and in that gaze, Caden saw Jalen, saw the boy he had failed, saw the man his son would never become. He turned away, unable to bear the weight of those eyes, the soft sound of laughter that rang through the rain like a memory of what he had lost. As he walked back to the waiting car, the rain washing away the tears he did not allow to fall, Caden felt the cold seep into his bones, the cold of grief, of regret, of the emptiness that no amount of wealth could warm. The boy's laughter echoed in his mind, the image of the paper airplane on the grave burning into his memory, a reminder that some ghosts could not be exorcised by time, that some losses demanded more than silence and flowers once a year. In the back seat of the SUV, as the driver pulled away from the cemetery, Caden looked back through the rain-speckled window, watching as the woman gathered the boy into her arms, lifting him as he buried his face against her neck, his small arms wrapping around her as she stood beside Jalen's grave. The boy lifted his head, looking out into the rain, and for a moment their eyes met again. The boy smiled, a small, shy smile, and waved before hiding his face once more. Caden turned away, closing his eyes as the city swallowed him once more, the rain washing the world clean while he remained stained by the memories of what he had been, of what he had failed to be. The boy's face, that smile, the laughter in the rain, followed him. A ghost he could not outrun, a promise he did not yet understand, but felt deep within the hollowed chambers of his heart. When he returned home that evening, the rain still falling, the sky dark with clouds that refused to break, Caden found himself standing in front of the locked room where Jalen's belongings were kept, his hand trembling on the doorknob. He did not open it. Instead, he leaned his forehead against the cool wood, his eyes closing as he saw again the boy's face, the paper airplane against the grave, the way the woman had held him as if he was the only thing in the world that mattered. He whispered into the darkness, his voice so low that even he could barely hear it, a promise forming on his lips without fully knowing why, only that it needed to be said. Tomorrow, he would find out who they were. Tomorrow, he would find out why they were there. Tomorrow, he would begin to uncover the truth that the rain could not wash away. And somewhere, deep in the silence of the house that was no longer a home, Caden felt something shift, something almost like hope, though he was too broken to name it yet. The rain had stopped by morning, leaving the streets of Atlanta damp and shining under the pale light that struggled through the cloud cover. Caden stood by the window of his office, looking down at the city that hummed beneath him with its constant motion, its cars and people and noise moving on as if the world had not been washed clean by the night's storm. He watched the slow crawl of traffic, the glint of sunlight against windshields, the hurried walk of people on the sidewalks below, umbrellas tucked under arms, collars turned up against the lingering chill. The world moved, always forward, while he felt as if he had been left standing still. His reflection in the glass looked back at him, tired eyes, silver streaking the black of his hair, lines around his mouth that had deepened in the years since Jalen's death. He raised a hand to touch the glass, watching as the reflection did the same. A ghost in the daylight, a man haunted by a promise he could not name, but could not ignore. He had come home from the cemetery the day before with the image of the boy's smile burned into his mind, the boy's laughter ringing in his ears like the echo of a memory he could not let go. The boy had Jalen's eyes. The thought would not leave him, circling in his mind as he tried to work, tried to focus on the numbers that scrolled across his screens, on the reports and updates from the companies that made up the empire he had built piece by piece, deal by deal, over decades of sacrifice and relentless ambition. The numbers blurred, the words lost their meaning, and all he could see was the small hand placing the paper airplane on Jalen's grave, the boy's eyes lifting to meet his with that curious, innocent gaze that cut deeper than any words could have. He had not slept that night. He had paced the halls of his house, silent rooms filled with the weight of what he had lost, what he had allowed himself to lose, telling himself it was for Jalen, for the future he wanted his son to have, even as he knew it was a lie he had repeated so often that he had begun to believe it. In the hours before dawn, as the sky shifted from black to gray, he had made the call, his voice steady, controlled, though his hands trembled as he held the phone. "I want you to find out who they are," he had told Marcus, his head of security, the man who had been with him for 15 years, who had stood beside him at Jalen's funeral in the cold rain, silent and watchful, understanding the things Caden could not say. "The woman and the boy. I need to know everything." Now, as he stood in his office, the city alive beneath him, he waited for Marcus to bring him the past he had tried so hard to bury. He turned away from the window when the door opened, Marcus stepping inside, a thick folder in his hand, his face giving nothing away as he crossed the room and set the folder down on the desk. "Her name is Lauren Carter," Marcus said, his voice calm, professional, as if he were delivering the details of a background check on a potential employee rather than the woman who had been crying at his son's grave. 27 years old, works 2 jobs, one at a diner near the outskirts of Memphis, another cleaning offices at night. Lives in a small apartment with her son, Joshua Carter, age 6. No record, no history of trouble, just surviving. Caden's hand hovered over the folder before he finally picked it up, opening it to see the photographs inside. Lauren, her hair pulled back, face tired but striking, the strength in her eyes clear even in the grainy image from a distance. Joshua, small, holding her hand as they crossed a street, his backpack too large for his small frame. His head tilted up as he looked at his mother, a smile on his lips that was painfully familiar. There were notes, addresses, the names of schools, the places she worked, the route she walked each day with her son, the details of a life lived in the quiet desperation of survival. He read it all, every word, every line, the images pressing down on him with the weight of truth he was not ready to face. When he finally closed the folder, the room felt smaller, the air heavy in his lungs. He looked at Marcus, who stood silently, waiting, understanding without asking the questions that hovered between them. "I need to know more," Caden said finally, his voice low, controlled, but it carried the edge of something breaking beneath the surface. "I need to know how she knew Jalen." Marcus nodded, understanding that this was no longer a request but an order. He left the room without another word, leaving Caden alone with the silence that roared louder than any noise. The days that followed were slow, each one stretching out as he waited, as he watched the city from his office, unable to lose himself in the work that once consumed him. He tried to read reports, to sit in meetings, to give orders and sign papers, but every moment felt distant, removed, like watching someone else live a life that no longer fit him. At night, he sat in Jalen's room. The door finally opened, dust covering the boxes that lined the walls, each one marked with his son's name, with dates and labels that meant nothing now. He opened them slowly, one by one, pulling out the pieces of a life he had missed while he was too busy building empires and closing deals. Drawings on crumpled paper, a baseball glove too small now, a stack of notebooks filled with sketches of planes and stars and dreams that Jalen had once tried to share with him. He found a photograph of Jalen at 15, standing by a lake, a fishing rod in his hand, his smile wide, his eyes bright, the wind lifting his hair as he looked back at the camera. at the father who had been too busy answering emails to see the way his son's eyes had pleaded for just one day together. Caden held the photograph in his hands, his fingers tracing the lines of his son's face, the memory of that day coming back in sharp, painful clarity. Jalen had wanted to go fishing, had begged him for weeks, and Caden had finally agreed, though he had spent most of the day on his phone, pacing along the shore while his son cast lines into the water, laughing when the fish slipped off the hook, calling to him, "Daddy, did you see that?" And he had looked up, given a small smile, nodded before turning back to the call that had seemed so important at the time. Now, in the silence of the room that smelled of dust and lost time, Caden closed his eyes and saw that day, saw the boy his son had been, saw the man he had never become, and felt the weight of every moment he had missed pressing down on him until it was hard to breathe. When Marcus returned with more information, Caden was ready, though he did not know what he was ready for, only that he needed the truth, needed to understand why the woman had been at his son's grave, why the boy looked at him with Jalen's eyes, why the sound of his laughter in the rain had felt like hope and grief all at once. They were close, Marcus said, setting down another folder, this one thinner but heavier somehow, the weight of it in the air between them. Jalen and Lauren. They met in high school, stayed in touch. She says they were just friends, but there's more, I think. She doesn't talk about him much, but people who know her say she kept a photograph of him by her bed for a long time. Caden opened the folder, seeing the reports, the notes from the conversations Marcus had with people who knew Lauren, neighbors, co-workers, teachers at the school Joshua attended. There was no scandal, no hidden drama, just the quiet, painful truth of two young people who had found something in each other that the world had not given them. Love, perhaps, or hope, or the promise of something better. She was at the funeral, Marcus added, his voice softer now, the words careful. She stood in the back, didn't approach you, didn't speak to anyone. She left before the service was over. Caden tried to remember, tried to see her in the sea of faces that had surrounded him that day, the faces that had blurred together in the haze of his grief and shock and the numbness that had settled over him like a shroud. He could not see her, could not remember if he had looked at the people who had come to say goodbye to his son, or if he had only seen the coffin, the flowers, the priest's lips moving around words that had meant nothing to him then. He closed the folder, leaning back in his chair, his eyes closing as he let the information settle, let the truth begin to take shape in the silence. The boy, Joshua, was 6 years old. Jalen had been dead for 7 years. The timeline was undeniable. The questions that had hovered around him like shadows now formed into something solid, something real, something that demanded answers he was not sure he was ready to face. He saw the boy's face again, the smile, the eyes that were too familiar, the way he had placed the paper airplane on the grave with such care. Caden stood, crossing the room to the window, looking out at the city that stretched beyond him, the life he had built with his hands, with his ambition, with his sacrifice. A life that had given him everything and nothing at all. He thought of Jalen, of the boy who had asked him once if he would ever have time to play, of the young man who had left the house that last night with a promise to be home for dinner, a promise he had never been able to keep. Now there was another boy, another promise forming in the quiet spaces of his heart, a promise he did not yet know how to fulfill, but one he could not ignore. He turned away from the window, his decision made, his path clear, even if the way forward was uncertain. Tomorrow he would go to Memphis. Tomorrow he would find Lauren Carter. Tomorrow he would look into the eyes of the boy who had Jalen's smile and find the truth that he owed to his son, to himself, to the life he had allowed to slip through his fingers. Tomorrow he would begin to reclaim the pieces of the past he had let fall, piece by piece, breath by breath, until he could finally look at himself in the mirror and see more than a man haunted by the ghost of his son. Tomorrow he would begin to atone. The air was heavy with the scent of late rain as Caden stepped off the private jet in Memphis, the tarmac glistening under the low sun that pushed through the clouds, trying to warm a city that seemed built from red brick and old stories. He felt the weight of the day pressing on him as he moved through the small terminal, his security detail shadowing him quietly. Marcus at his side, eyes scanning out of habit, even though Caden had ordered the visit to remain quiet. To be nothing more than a man stepping into the past to find the truth he had ignored for too long. In the car, Caden stared out the window as they left the small airport, the city shifting around them from new glass to the worn faces of neighborhoods that carried history in every crack of the sidewalk. Memphis was a city of music, of grit, of people who knew how to survive storms, and he felt the difference in the air from Atlanta's polished heat. This place was closer to the ground, to the truth of living, and as they crossed intersections past small corner stores with faded awnings, Caden wondered how many times Jalen had walked these streets without him ever knowing. The ache of not knowing his son's full life pressed deeper each block they passed, each piece of the city revealing itself like pages of a book he had never taken the time to read. Lauren Carter lived in a 2-story building that had seen better days. Its paint faded, the steps leading to the second-floor apartment worn from years of feet climbing with tired determination. Children played in the small courtyard, their laughter ringing in the warm air, bouncing against the brick walls as mothers watched from open windows, laundry swaying like flags above them. It was life, noisy and imperfect, and Caden found himself pausing at the base of the stairs, the echoes of the children's shouts reminding him painfully of another laugh, of Jalen calling to him in the yard of their old home, begging him to come play, to watch, to simply be there. Marcus gave him a look, a question in his eyes that Caden waved away. He climbed the stairs alone, each step loud in his ears, each breath a reminder that he was crossing into a world he had chosen to ignore, a world his son had been part of, leaving behind a piece of himself in the shape of a small boy who had smiled at him through the rain. Lauren answered the door with a caution that turned to shock when she saw him standing there, his tailored jacket and polished shoes at odds with the narrow hallway behind her, lined with children's shoes and a faded rug. Her hair was pulled back, her eyes tired but alert, and she held the door halfway closed as if to guard the space behind her, as if to guard the boy who was his blood, his legacy, and who did not know the weight of the world that had created him. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the silence filled with the weight of all the questions Caden had carried with him from Atlanta, the questions that had haunted him in the dark hours of the night, when Jalen's face would appear in the shadows, when he would hear his son's laugh in the rustle of the trees outside his window, when the memory of the paper airplane on the grave would wake him from sleep with tears he would not let fall. Lauren's voice was calm, low, but steady when she finally spoke, asking why he was there, what he wanted, and Caden found himself struggling for words that seemed too small for what he needed to say, too thin to carry the truth of what had driven him to her door. He told her about the cemetery, about the boy, about the way the child's eyes had looked into his and seen something he could not yet understand, but could not deny. He told her he needed to know, needed to understand, needed to see the truth that had lived quietly in the spaces where Jalen's life had ended and Joshua's had begun. Lauren's eyes did not soften as he spoke. Instead, they grew sharper, as if she were holding each word he offered up to the light, measuring its weight, its truth, its purpose. She did not invite him in. She stepped out onto the small landing, closing the door behind her with a soft click, the lock sliding into place, the sounds of children's laughter and cartoons leaking out from under the door as she folded her arms across her chest and studied him. She told him that Jalen had been a part of her life, that he had been a young man who had loved fiercely, who had wanted to make the world better in small ways, who had spent time in neighborhoods that people like Caden did not see, teaching art at a community center, helping to fix bikes for children who could not afford new ones, showing up with smiles and laughter, with dreams that did not fit into boardrooms and profit margins. She told him about the boy who had loved to draw, who would sit with her on the steps of her apartment, sketching the world around him with a concentration that made her fall in love with him, quietly, completely, in a way that she had never been able to tell him in words. She told him that Joshua was her son and that Jalen was his father. The words hit Caden like a wave, knocking the breath from him, the world narrowing to the sound of her voice, to the truth that he had suspected but had not allowed himself to believe. Jalen's son, his grandson. The boy with Jalen's eyes, Jalen's smile, Jalen's laughter ringing in the rain, was a piece of his son left behind in a world that had felt so empty since the day he died. Caden asked to see him, his voice quiet, almost a plea, and Lauren's eyes flickered, her arms tightening around herself as she shook her head, telling him that it was not that simple, that she had kept Joshua away from the world Caden represented because she had seen what that world had done to Jalen, how it had taken him from the things that mattered, how it had pulled him into shadows that he could not escape. She told him she did not want that for her son, that she had promised Jalen she would protect their child from the weight of expectations, from the coldness of a world built on money and power, from the loneliness that came from being a part of a family that did not know how to love without conditions. They stood there, the city around them alive with the sounds of life continuing, while Caden tried to find the words to tell her that he understood, that he was not the man he had been, that he wanted to know his grandson, to see him, to hear his laugh not from a distance but close enough to hold on to, close enough to know that a part of Jalen still lived in the world, still moved and laughed and dreamed. Lauren's eyes softened then, just slightly, as she told him that Joshua was at school, that he would be home in a few hours, and that she needed time to think, to decide what was right for her son, for the child she had raised alone, with stories of a father who had loved him, who had wanted to be there but could not. She told him to come back the next day, to give her time, to let her find the words she needed to say to a boy who would one day ask about the man who came to the door asking to see him, to know him, to love him. Caden agreed, though the waiting felt like another lifetime to add to the years he had already lost. He left her standing on the landing, her eyes watching him as he descended the stairs, each step heavy with the promise of what tomorrow might bring, each breath a reminder that he was closer now to the truth than he had ever been, closer to Jalen than he had been in the years since his son's death. He spent the night in a small hotel near the river, the sound of the water outside his window, a steady rhythm that reminded him of the way Jalen would breathe as he slept when he was a boy, curled up under blankets with his favorite stuffed bear, a bear that still sat in a box back in Atlanta, waiting, like him, for a chance to be held again. In the morning, the sky was clear, the sun warm against the city as he made his way back to Lauren's apartment, each step filled with the hope and fear that came with the promise of seeing his grandson, of seeing Jalen's eyes looking up at him, of hearing his laughter, and knowing that some part of his son had survived, had continued, had found a way to live in a world that had felt so empty without him. Lauren opened the door before he could knock, her face calm, her eyes clear, and she stepped aside, letting him into the small apartment that smelled of breakfast and crayons and the soft, warm scent of a home that was lived in, loved in, despite the worn furniture and the cracked paint on the walls. Toys were scattered across the floor, a small table covered in drawings, paper airplanes lined up along the windowsill as if waiting for a wind strong enough to carry them away. Joshua was sitting on the floor, his legs crossed, a small car in his hands, his head lifting as the door closed, his eyes meeting Caden's with a curiosity that was open, fearless, and so familiar that it made Caden's heart ache with a pain so sharp it almost felt like joy. The boy smiled, a slow, shy smile that grew as he stood, the car clutched in one hand, his other hand lifting in a small wave as he said hello, his voice bright, clear, the sound of it filling the room with a warmth that Caden had not felt in years. And in that moment, as the boy's laughter bubbled up as he ran to show his mother the drawing he had made, as he looked back at Caden with eyes so like Jalen's, Caden felt something inside him begin to heal, a small piece of the emptiness filling with the light of hope, with the promise of a future that was not lost, with the knowledge that love, once given, never truly died. Jalen was gone, but his son lived. And for the first time in a long time, Caden felt alive too. Caden could still hear Joshua's laughter echoing in his ears as he sat alone in the small Memphis hotel room, the boy's bright eyes and the tilt of his head so achingly familiar that they had followed him back, settling in the quiet like a memory that refused to leave. It was past midnight, but he found himself sitting on the edge of the bed, his suit jacket draped over the back of a chair, the tie on the nightstand, his hands clasped together as he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. There had been a moment that afternoon when Joshua had looked back at him with Jalen's eyes, a crayon in his small hand, and in that brief, fleeting second, Caden had felt as if his son were in the room again, as if the years between them had vanished, as if laughter and hope were things he was allowed to touch again. Lauren had watched him carefully during that visit, her eyes moving from him to her son, gauging every expression, every word, every breath, as if weighing whether this man, who carried the scent of money and polished hallways, could be allowed to exist within the fragile, careful world she had built for her son. She had offered him coffee in a chipped mug, her hand brushing a curl from Joshua's forehead, as the boy proudly showed him a drawing of a plane flying under a sky full of stars. A drawing so much like the ones Jalen had made that it pulled at something deep within him, something that had been buried under years of silence and regret. They had spoken quietly, Lauren's voice steady, but there was steel beneath it. A resolve that had been shaped by years of raising a child alone, of protecting him from the sharp edges of a world that did not care about promises or dreams. She had told him that Jalen had been a good man, that he had loved Joshua even before he was born, that he had wanted to be there, to watch him grow, to teach him to throw a baseball and to build paper planes that could fly higher than the rooftops, that he had promised to be there. Her eyes had gone distant then, her fingers tracing the edge of the table, and she had said that Jalen had wanted to tell Caden about Joshua, that he had planned to do it, but he had been afraid of his father's disappointment, of the cold distance that had been between them, of the fear that Caden would see Joshua as a mistake instead of a blessing. Caden had not known what to say then, the words catching in his throat, because there had been a time when that might have been true, when he would have seen his son's unexpected child as a complication, an inconvenience, a distraction from the path he had laid out for Jalen to follow. It was a truth that burned now, that lay heavy in his chest as he remembered the countless times he had pushed Jalen away, telling him that dreams could wait, that art was a hobby, that life was about building, about climbing, about becoming strong enough that the world could not touch you. He had seen Jalen's disappointment in those moments, the way his son's shoulders would slump, the way his eyes would shudder, closing off the light that had once lived there so brightly. He had told himself then that it was for the best, that it was his job as a father to prepare his son for the harshness of the world, to make him strong, to make him sharp, to teach him that love and dreams were luxuries a Hale could not afford until the work was done, until the empire was secure, until the world was theirs to shape. Now, in the quiet of the hotel room, the truth was a weight he could barely bear, the understanding that he had stripped his son of the very things that might have saved him, that might have kept him alive, that might have given him a reason to come home that night instead of driving alone on a dark road toward a meeting he would never reach. Lauren had told him that Jalen had died trying to protect something, that he had gotten caught up in something he did not fully understand, that he had been trying to get out of it, to clean up the mess, to protect her and their child, to find a way to make it right. She had looked at Caden then, her eyes hard, and said that she had tried to call him, that she had left messages, that she had begged for help when she found out what Jalen had been involved in, but the calls had gone unanswered, the messages unreturned, the doors closed. She had told him that she had buried Jalen alone, standing at the back of the funeral because she could not bear the coldness of the front, the way people spoke about his son as if he had been a stranger to them, as if his laughter and his dreams had not existed. Caden had listened, each word cutting deeper than the last, the image of Jalen as a boy holding out a drawing, asking him to look, to see, to understand, playing in his mind over and over, a plea he had ignored too many times. He had tried to explain, to tell Lauren that he had not known, that he had been drowning in grief, in work, in the suffocating emptiness that had filled the house after Jalen's death, that he had not seen the messages, that he had not understood what she was asking for. She had listened, her arms around Joshua, her eyes tired, and had simply nodded, as if she had heard it all before, as if she had accepted long ago that the world did not owe her explanations. Now, as the city outside settled into sleep, Caden sat in the silence and understood that he had failed his son in ways that could never be fixed, that he had failed Lauren, that he had failed Joshua before the boy had even known who he was. It was a truth that tasted bitter, that filled his mouth with ashes, but it was a truth he needed to carry, a truth he needed to remember if he was to be anything more than the ghost of a father to the boy who now slept in a small bed under a ceiling covered in glow-in-the-dark stars, the same way Jalen's room had once been, before the stars had gone dark. In the morning, he returned to the apartment, the street alive with the sounds of a city waking up, the smell of coffee and exhaust filling the air. Lauren let him in this time without hesitation. Joshua running to the door, his eyes bright, a drawing already in his hand to show him, a plane flying under a sun that smiled, birds dancing in the corners of the paper, the lines messy and full of joy. Caden knelt, taking the drawing, his fingers careful as he held it, the boy's laughter bubbling up as he pointed out the details, the colors, the tiny heart in the corner that he said was for his dad, for the dad who lived in the stars. It was a moment that felt fragile, like glass, and Caden held it carefully, meeting the boy's eyes and smiling. A real smile that felt strange on his face, unused muscles remembering how to shape joy. Lauren watched from the kitchen, her hands around a mug of coffee, her eyes softening as she saw them together, as she saw her son's happiness, his excitement, his pride. Later, while Joshua played with his toys on the floor, Lauren told him about Jalen's last days, about the phone calls late at night, the fear in his voice, the way he had tried to shield her from the truth, from the danger, from the weight of the choices he had made. She told him that Jalen had gotten involved with people who promised him quick money, who had used his kindness, his desperation to provide, who had threatened him when he tried to leave, who had followed him, who had been there that night on the road. Caden listened, the pieces fallen into place, the shadows in his son's eyes in those last months now making sense, the calls he had ignored, the dinners Jalen had missed, the way he had stopped asking for time, for space, for understanding. Each piece was a knife, cutting away the lies he had told himself, leaving him raw, exposed, and he made a promise to Lauren, to Joshua, to Jalen's memory, that he would find the truth, that he would make it right, that he would not let his son's death be a shadow that swallowed the light of the boy who now carried his laughter, his smile, his dreams. Joshua ran to him then, a paper airplane in his hand, asking him to play, to come outside, to watch, to be there, and Caden went, stepping into the small courtyard, the sun warm on his face, the boy's laughter rising as the plane flew, dipping and soaring, a bright streak of color against the blue sky. And in that moment, as he caught the plane, as Joshua clapped his hands, as Lauren stood in the doorway, her eyes shining, Caden felt something in him begin to heal, a slow, painful stitching of wounds that had been open for too long. Jalen was gone, but his son was here, alive, laughing, dreaming, and Caden would be there this time. He would not leave. He would not miss the chance to see, to hear, to know. He would be the father, the grandfather, the man he should have been. And in the warmth of the sun, in the sound of Joshua's laughter, in the quiet strength of Lauren's gaze, Caden began to believe that redemption was not just a word, but a path. One he was ready to walk, step by careful step, toward the light that Jalen had once carried so brightly. Caden woke before dawn, the sky outside the hotel window a pale shade of gray, the world caught in that quiet pause before the day truly began. He lay in the silence, eyes open, the hum of the air conditioner and the soft ticking of the wall clock, marking the minutes as his mind replayed the sound of Joshua's laughter, the brightness in his grandson's eyes as they had thrown paper planes in the courtyard, the warmth of the sunlight on his skin as the boy had shouted, "Do it again, Grandpa, do it again." The word had slipped from Joshua's mouth so easily, so innocently, filling the space around them with a hope so raw it had brought tears to Caden's eyes, tears he had turned away to hide as he bent to pick up the fallen plane. Now, in the stillness, he thought of Jalen, of the way his son's shoulders would tense when he was trying to hide something, the way he would avoid his father's gaze when the weight of the world pressed too heavily on him. There had been signs, moments that Caden had ignored in the blur of meetings, contracts, boardrooms, the constant drive to build, to expand, to conquer. He had seen his son's silence and mistaken it for rebellion, seen his fear and mistaken it for weakness, seen his dreams and mistaken them for distractions. The truth of those moments pressed on him now like a physical weight, each memory cutting deeper as he accepted how blind he had been to the cries for help that Jalen had hidden beneath forced smiles and late-night absences. Caden pushed himself up from the bed, the cold air biting against his skin as he moved to the window, pulling back the thin curtain to look out over the waking city. Lights flickered on in windows, cars moved slowly along wet streets, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the low call of a train, the sound carrying through the dawn like a reminder that the world would keep moving, with or without him. He could not change the past, but he could face the truth of it, and he could protect what Jalen had left behind. He dressed in silence, the ritual of pulling on his shirt, fastening his watch, adjusting the cuffs grounding him as he prepared for the day ahead. Marcus was waiting in the lobby, his posture alert, eyes sharp as always, but there was a softness in his gaze as he handed Caden a cup of coffee, the simple gesture saying what words could not. They did not speak as they left the hotel, stepping into the cool morning air, the sky brightening slowly with the promise of sunrise. The drive to the small office Marcus had rented was quiet, the city shifting around them as the light grew, painting the buildings in soft golds and pinks before the sun rose fully, bringing the hard blue of day. Caden watched the streets, the people moving through them, the parents walking children to school, the workers waiting at bus stops, the old men sitting on porches with cups of coffee, nodding to each other as the world passed by. It was a city alive with stories, each one hidden behind faces that moved quickly with purpose, unaware that a man in the back of a dark car was watching, remembering the boy he had lost and the boy he had found. Inside the office, the air was cool, the lights bright against the simple furniture. A folding table covered in papers and photographs, a laptop open with files displayed on the screen. Marcus moved to the table, picking up a folder and handing it to Caden, his eyes meeting his as he spoke quietly. "We found something." Caden took the folder, the weight of it heavy in his hands as he opened it, the photographs and documents inside pulling him into a world he had chosen not to see, a world his son had been pulled into, piece by piece, until it had taken everything from him. There were images of men, faces hard and eyes cold, men who smiled in photographs as they shook hands over deals that were never meant to be clean. There were documents showing transactions, transfers of money through shell companies, through fake charities and small businesses, money that moved quietly, invisibly, until it found its way into the hands of men who used it to buy silence, to buy power, to buy the lives of those too desperate to say no. Among the papers was a photograph of Jalen, standing beside one of the men, his face tight, eyes wary, a forced smile on his lips as he held a folder in his hands. The sight of his son's face, caught in that moment, in that place, struck Caden with a force that left him breathless, his hands trembling as he touched the edge of the photograph, tracing the lines of Jalen's face, the curve of his mouth, the tension in his shoulders that spoke of fear, of regret, of a young man in over his head. Marcus spoke, his voice calm, steady, explaining what they had found, how Jalen had been approached by men who promised quick money, who had used his kindness, his desperation to provide for the life he wanted to build with Lauren and their unborn child, how they had pulled him into their schemes, using him to move money, to sign papers, to be a face that could pass unnoticed, a name that carried just enough weight to open doors without raising alarms. Jalen had realized too late what he was involved in, had tried to pull away, had tried to protect Lauren, to protect the child he had not yet met, to clean up the mess before it swallowed him whole. The night he died, he had been on his way to meet one of the men, to return money he had taken, to walk away, to end it. But they had followed him, forcing his car off the road, ensuring his silence, ensuring that the truth would die with him. Caden listened, each word a blade, each revelation a cut, as the life he had believed his son had led was stripped away, replaced with the truth of a young man trying to fight his way out of a darkness he should never have faced alone. His mind replayed every moment he had missed, every call he had ignored, every time he had told Jalen that dreams could wait, that work came first, that there would be time later to talk, to understand, to see. There was no later. Caden closed the folder, his eyes burning, the weight of his failures heavy in his chest as he looked at Marcus, his voice quiet, controlled, but carrying the edge of steel that had built an empire. "We find them," he said, his hand tightening around the folder. "We find them, and we end this." Marcus nodded, understanding the promise in his employer's voice, the promise of a father who had lost too much, who would not lose again. The investigation grew, days turning into nights as they followed trails of money, of names, of lies that twisted around each other like vines, choking the light from the truth. They uncovered names Caden recognized, men he had shaken hands with, men who had sat at his table, who had smiled and laughed, who had toasted to deals and futures, their eyes hiding secrets that now came to light, secrets that led back to Jalen, to the night he died, to the moment when his car had left the road, the fire consuming the dreams he had held on to so desperately. Each discovery was a betrayal, each name a wound, as Caden realized how deeply the corruption ran, how closely it had sat beside him, how blind he had been to the rot that had grown in the shadows of the empire he had built. He confronted them, one by one, in offices and boardrooms, in quiet corners of restaurants, in the hallways of buildings that bore his name, his voice calm, his eyes cold, as he demanded the truth, as he stripped away the lies, as he watched them crumble, their power nothing against the fury of a father who had nothing left to lose. He turned over evidence to the authorities, the cases building, the arrests following, the headlines filled with names that once held power, now tainted, now falling, as the truth came to light. He sold parts of his company, dismantling the pieces that had been built on shadows, on lies, on the blood of his son, using the money to build something new, something real, something that would honor Jalen's memory instead of staining it further. In the quiet moments, when the calls were done, when the meetings ended, when the world went still, Caden would sit alone, Jalen's drawing spread out before him, the lines of planes and stars and dreams reminding him of the boy who had once believed in a world where hope could fly. He would think of Joshua, of the way the boy's eyes would light up when he laughed, of the way he would run to him, arms open, trusting, unknowing of the darkness that had once threatened to swallow the life he now lived so fully. Caden promised himself that he would protect that light, that he would guard it, that he would build a future for Joshua that was free of the shadows, free of the lies, free of the weight that had taken Jalen from him. He would give his grandson the world Jalen had dreamed of, a world where dreams were not luxuries, where love was not a weakness, where a father's promise meant something, where a child's laughter was the loudest sound in the room. And in those moments, as he looked out over the city, the lights glowing in the darkness, Caden would whisper to the memory of his son, "I see you now. I hear you now. I will not fail him, Jalen. I will not fail him the way I failed you." Caden stood by the window of the lake house, his hand resting on the cool glass as dawn spread slowly across the water, turning the surface into liquid gold. It was quiet here, the kind of quiet that allowed a man to hear his own breath, to feel the slow beat of his heart, to remember the echoes of laughter that once belonged to a boy who used to run through hallways with a paper plane in hand, calling out for him to look, to see, to be there. The house smelled of coffee and warmth now, the air alive with the soft creaks of floorboards, the rustle of blankets, the small sounds of a home that was learning how to be alive again. Joshua's laughter rose from the back porch, a bright, clear sound that cut through the morning mist like light, pulling Caden away from the ghosts that lived in the quiet. He watched as the boy ran across the deck, bare feet tapping against the wood, a paper airplane gripped tightly in one hand, the other waving for him to come see, come play, come be part of this moment that was too precious to lose. Lauren stepped out behind him, a mug in her hands, her hair pulled back as she smiled, her eyes soft as they followed her son, as they found Caden through the glass, nodding once, a small gesture of trust that had taken months to build. It had started slowly, cautiously, with days spent sitting on the porch watching Joshua play, with small conversations over coffee, with quiet moments where they shared the silence, letting it heal what words could not. Lauren had been clear from the beginning, her voice steady as she told him that Joshua was not a replacement, not a second chance for him to erase the failures of the past, that he was not a promise to be used to ease the guilt that had settled in Caden's bones. She told him that if he wanted to be here, to be part of Joshua's life, it had to be for the boy, for the bright light that he was, for the dreams he carried, not as a way to make peace with the ghosts of a son lost to choices long made. Caden had listened, accepting the weight of her words, letting them carve away the illusions he had built around the idea of redemption. He had come to learn that redemption was not a single act, not a grand gesture that could erase the past, but a collection of small moments, of choices made again and again, of showing up even when it was hard, of being there when it mattered, of building something real from the ashes of what was lost. He started by spending weekends at the lake house, bringing books for Joshua, sitting with him on the porch as they read stories about stars and planes, about the sky that Jalen had once loved so much. They would build model airplanes together, Joshua's small hands careful as he pressed the pieces into place, his eyes bright with concentration, glancing up at Caden for approval, for pride, for the quiet encouragement that Caden learned to give without hesitation. He would take Joshua fishing, showing him how to hold the rod, how to feel the line, how to be patient, how to laugh when the fish slipped away, how to let the moment be enough. At first, Joshua had been shy, hiding behind Lauren's legs, peeking out with wide eyes, unsure of this man who came with gifts and stories, whose smile was careful, whose eyes carried a sadness he did not understand. But children know the truth of people, and Joshua learned that Caden was there to stay, that he would be there in the mornings to help pour the cereal, that he would be there in the evenings to read stories before bed, that he would be there to watch the paper planes fly across the yard, clapping when they soared, laughing when they crashed, helping to build them again. Lauren watched all of this with a cautious hope, her heart learning to trust slowly, her eyes softening each time she saw Joshua run to Caden with a drawing, a question, a laugh that needed to be shared. They built a quiet partnership, learning how to parent together, how to hold space for a child who needed them both, how to navigate the small moments of joy and frustration that came with raising a child who carried so much light in him that it sometimes hurt to look at. Caden found himself changing in these moments, learning to listen, to be present, to let go of the constant hum of business, of meetings, of deals that once ruled his every hour. He scaled back his work, selling off parts of the company that carried the stain of the past, using the money to build something new, something real. He created the Jalen Hale Foundation, funding art programs in schools, building community centers in neighborhoods that needed them, giving children the chance to dream, to learn, to build paper planes that could fly higher than the world told them they could. He did it in Jalen's name, but he also did it for Joshua, for the world his grandson would grow up in, for the promise of a future that could be different from the past. He did it for Lauren, whose quiet strength had held her together through years of raising a child alone, whose trust was a gift he would not take for granted. He did it for himself, for the man he was becoming, for the man he wished he had been, for the father he should have been. There were moments when the past would rise, when Caden would find himself standing in Jalen's old room in the lake house, the walls covered in his son's drawings, the bed neatly made, the air filled with the quiet hum of memories. He would close his eyes and remember Jalen's laugh, the way he would run across the yard with a plane in his hand, shouting for his father to watch, to see, to be there. He would feel the weight of the years he had missed, the moments he could never get back, and he would let the grief wash over him, letting it remind him of the promise he had made to himself, to Jalen, to Joshua. One evening, as the sun set over the lake, painting the water in shades of gold and pink, Joshua sat beside Caden on the porch, his small body leaning against his side, his eyes watching the stars begin to appear in the darkening sky. "Grandpa," he said softly, "do you think Daddy can see the planes I make?" Caden's breath caught, the question wrapping around his heart, pulling tight as he looked down at the boy, at the hope in his eyes, at the trust, at the love that was so freely given. "Yes, kiddo," Caden said, his voice steady, his hand resting on Joshua's shoulder, squeezing gently. "I think he sees every single one. And I think he's proud of you, just like I am." Joshua smiled then, his head resting against Caden's arm as they sat in the quiet, the stars reflecting in the water, the night wrapping around them like a promise. In that moment, Caden felt the weight of the past and the hope of the future meeting in the small, warm body of the boy beside him, in the soft sounds of the lake, in the laughter that would come again in the morning when they built new planes, when they tried again to see how high they could fly. Caden knew that redemption was not a place you arrived at, but a journey you chose every day, in the way you showed up, in the way you loved, in the way you allowed yourself to be loved in return. He had missed so much, but he would not miss this, would not miss the chance to be the man his son had needed, the man his grandson deserved, the man who would stand beside Lauren, building a family out of the pieces left behind, creating something whole, something true, something that would last. And in the soft, quiet dark of that evening, as Joshua drifted to sleep in his arms, as the stars watched from above, Caden allowed himself to believe that he could be forgiven, that he could forgive himself, that he could build a life where love was not a weakness, but the strongest thing he could offer. He whispered a promise to the night, to Jalen, to Joshua, to himself, a promise that he would keep, one day at a time, one breath at a time, one paper plane at a time, flying higher, brighter, carrying the light of a future they would build together. The morning light came early to the lake house that spring, pouring through the wide windows and painting the wooden floors in soft gold, the air filled with the scent of pine and the promise of warmth. The water outside was calm, a glassy surface reflecting the sky that stretched above, a sky so blue it seemed to reach forever. The sounds of birds calling from the trees mixed with the gentle rustling of leaves, and in the quiet there was the sound of laughter, clear and bright, a reminder that life had returned to this place, that hope had taken root in the soil where grief once settled like frost. Caden stood on the porch, the warmth of the rising sun on his face, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold as he watched Joshua run across the yard, his small feet leaving prints in the dew-wet grass. A paper plane held high above his head as he shouted for him to look, to see, to watch. Lauren was near the garden, her hands busy in the soil, her hair pulled back, her smile easy as she glanced up at her son, her eyes meeting Caden's with a quiet, steady warmth that spoke of the trust they had built, of the family they had formed, piece by careful piece, day by quiet day. It had been almost a year since Caden had first stood at Jalen's grave and seen the small boy with the paper plane, the boy whose laughter had pierced the walls he had built around himself, whose eyes had reflected a light he thought he would never see again. It had been a year of slow healing, of hard truths faced and accepted, of learning how to be present, how to give without conditions, how to receive the fragile, powerful love of a child who had never stopped believing in the goodness of the world. The lake house had become a home, not just a place to escape the city, but a place where life was lived fully, where mornings were spent on the porch with coffee and soft conversations, where afternoons were filled with the laughter of a child, the hum of the garden being tended, the quiet moments of sitting together under the wide sky, letting the breeze carry away the remnants of old regrets. Evenings were spent by the water, the stars bright above as they told stories, as Joshua fell asleep against Caden's side, as Lauren rested her head on his shoulder, as the world outside fell away, leaving only the soft, steady rhythm of breathing, of living, of being. Elizabeth had come to visit, her car pulling up the gravel drive one crisp afternoon, her eyes cautious as she stepped out, her hands twisting together before she looked up at the house that had once been just another property in her father's portfolio. She had not seen him in years, not truly, not in the way that mattered, their conversations strained, clipped, filled with the polite distance that came from wounds left untended for too long. But she had come, her eyes drawn to the laughter that floated across the yard as Joshua ran to greet her, his arms open, his smile wide, welcoming her without hesitation, without judgment, without the history that weighed down the adults around him. She had knelt to hug him, her eyes glistening as she looked up at Caden, and in that moment, something shifted between them, something softening, something forgiving. They spent that afternoon together, sitting by the water, Elizabeth's head leaning against her father's shoulder as Joshua built towers of stones, knocking them down with peals of laughter, the sound echoing across the lake, carrying with it the promise of new beginnings, of a family finding its way back to each other. Caden had taken Joshua fishing that week, the boy's excitement bubbling over as he learned to cast the line, to wait, to watch the water, his small hands gripping the rod with determination, his eyes bright with hope each time the line pulled. They sat on the old dock, their feet dangling above the water, the sun warm on their backs, and Joshua had turned to him, his eyes wide, his voice soft as he asked, "Grandpa, do you think Daddy would have liked fishing with me?" The question had settled between them, gentle but heavy, and Caden had swallowed against the tightness in his throat before he answered, his hand resting on Joshua's shoulder, squeezing gently as he spoke. "Yes, he would have loved it, kiddo. He would have loved every minute of it, just like I do now." Joshua had smiled then, leaning against him as they watched the water, the world quiet around them, the air filled with the soft sounds of birds and the rustle of the trees, the moment stretching out, timeless and precious, a moment that would live in Caden's memory, a reminder of why he was here, of what he had chosen to build, of the promise he was keeping. The Jalen Hale Foundation had grown, funding art programs in schools, building community centers, supporting young people who needed a place to dream, to create, to learn. Caden visited the programs often, watching children paint, build, discover, their eyes filled with the same light he had seen in Jalen's eyes, the same light he now saw in Joshua's. He spoke to parents, to teachers, to the children themselves, listening to their stories, letting their hopes and dreams remind him of why he was here, of what mattered, of what was worth fighting for. At the lake house, life moved with the steady rhythm of days well lived. Joshua learned to ride a bike, his laughter ringing out as he wobbled down the driveway, Lauren cheering him on, Caden jogging beside him, ready to catch him if he fell, ready to let him fly when he found his balance. They planted a small garden, the soil rich and dark under their hands, the promise of growth in each seed they placed, in each plant they nurtured, in each flower that bloomed under the warm sun. They spent evenings together, cooking simple meals, laughing over stories, letting Joshua's endless questions fill the air, his curiosity boundless, his joy infectious. Caden found himself laughing more, the sound unfamiliar at first but slowly becoming part of him again, a reminder that healing was possible, that joy was not something to fear, but something to embrace. There were still moments when the past would reach for him, in the quiet hours of the night when the house was still, when he would find himself standing by the window, looking out at the stars, remembering Jalen's face, the sound of his laughter, the dreams he had held, the life he had wanted to live. In those moments, Caden would close his eyes, letting the grief wash over him, letting it remind him of the love that had never left, of the promise he had made to carry forward, to protect, to honor. On the anniversary of Jalen's death, they went together to the cemetery, the air warm with the promise of summer, the sky a clear, brilliant blue. Joshua held a bouquet of wildflowers, his small hands steady as he walked between Lauren and Caden, Elizabeth beside them, their steps slow, measured, the silence between them filled with the soft rustle of the wind through the trees, with the quiet strength of a family walking together. At the grave, Joshua knelt, placing the flowers carefully, his head bowed as he whispered something that only the breeze could hear. He stood, pulling a small painting from his backpack, a picture of the lake house under a sky filled with stars, a paper plane flying high, and he placed it beside the flowers, his eyes bright as he looked up at Caden. "I made this for Daddy," he said softly, "so he knows we're okay." Caden knelt, pulling Joshua into his arms, holding him close, his eyes closing as he pressed a kiss to the boy's hair. The warmth of him, the life of him, grounding him in the moment, reminding him of the promise he had kept, of the love that lived on, of the future that was theirs to build. Elizabeth rested her hand on his shoulder, her touch a quiet affirmation, her presence a testament to the healing they had found together, to the family they were, to the love that had grown in the spaces where grief once lived. They stood together, the four of them, the breeze moving around them, the sun warm on their skin, the world quiet and bright, the memory of Jalen alive in the laughter they would carry forward, and the dreams they would nurture, and the life they would live, fully, fearlessly, with love. That evening, back at the lake house, they sat on the dock as the stars appeared, one by one, the sky darkening, the water reflecting the light above. Joshua leaned against Caden's side, his eyes wide as he watched the stars, his voice soft as he asked, "Do you think Daddy can see us now?" Caden looked up, the stars bright above, the memory of Jalen alive in every breath, in every heartbeat, in every promise kept. "I know he does, kiddo," he whispered, his arm around Joshua, holding him close. "I know he does. And I know he's proud of you, just like I am." And in that moment, under the vast, star-filled sky with the water reflecting the light, with Joshua's warmth against him, with Lauren and Elizabeth sitting nearby, with the promise of tomorrow alive in the air, Caden knew that they had found their way home, that they had built a life worth living, a life where love was the center, where dreams could fly, where hope was not just a word, but a truth they carried together into every dawn. If you found this story meaningful, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Check out the other videos on this channel for more stories you might connect with. And feel free to share this video with someone who needs to hear it today.